Decades before the European Union or NATO even existed, a Polish statesman sat in a prison cell and designed the blueprint for a united Europe. Not the Western liberal projects you know today, but something more raw, in a way that's more honest about power. And this is the story of the Intermarium, or Międzymorze in Polish, the first truly anti-imperialist political project in European history, and it was conceived by a country that had spent 123 years erased from the map. Hey Slavic Vikings, and I am currently a European soldier, and I am a radical centrist who wants EU unification into one country above anything else. I also lived in Poland for most of my childhood, where in history class I learned about the Intermarium project for the first time. And today I'm going to cover what it was, why it failed, and why it is more relevant than ever. Because Poland is quietly trying to revive it, and if it succeeds, it will fundamentally reshape what a united Europe actually looks like. The word in itself is Latin, inter mare, or between the seas, specifically the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic in the Mediterranean. At its core membership, it includes Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. So that's the combined population of around 120 million people today. However, if we stretch it to its maximum plausible extent by adding the Balkans, Belarus, and Finland, you are approaching 170 million people or more, and that is larger than Germany and France combined. So this region shares one defining historical experience, and that is being crushed between two empires, Germany to the west and Russia to the east, and to an extent the Ottomans from the south as well. And for centuries, the nations living here were not the map painters of imperialism. Instead, they were its victims. They were invaded, partitioned, administered, erased, redrawn, and invaded again. All because of tribal motivations for bigger borders. And one man looked at that history and decided the only rational response was a federation. Józef Piłsudski. And every Polish person knows about this goat. And he was born in 1867 in what was then the Russian Empire. He was arrested by the Tsar's secret police, sent to Siberian gulags, and escaped by faking mental illness. He came back, however, and he spent years as a revolutionary until he led the military campaign that restored Polish independence in 1918. Then just 2 years later, he personally commanded the army that stopped the Soviet advance at Warsaw and pushed Russia back. He was the main reason Poland won the war against Russia after World War I and the reason we regained our independence. However, Piłsudski was not the nationalist in the traditional sense. He was actually a federalist. His vision was not for a Poland that maximized its own borders and territory and power at the expense of its neighbors. Instead, his vision was a federation of equal nations. Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Latvians, all of them, bound together specifically because none of them were strong enough to survive alone between Germany and Russia. And he called it Międzymorze. Międzymorze, or the Intermarium translated to Latin or English, whatever. And the core idea for Międzymorze was genuinely radical for its time, and honestly, sadly, it's still kinda radical today. And that was that the correct response to imperial external pressure is not more nationalism, but instead cooperation. He believed that that is the rational conclusion you should take when looking at the map of the modern world from an unemotional perspective of reason. However, Piłsudski was not perfect. His federalist vision and actual policies were often in direct contradiction, since Poland did fight territorial wars against Lithuania and Ukraine, the same nations the Federation needed as equal partners. And also after 1926, his government slid into soft authoritarianism. And to his neighbors, the Intermarium increasingly looked less like a union of equals and more like the Polish Empire with better branding. And to be honest, this wasn't really paranoia, because there's a lot of evidence to back this up. since once again, tribalism corrupted the geopolitical goal of cooperation. However, in theory, what Piłsudski proposed was a formal political confederation with shared military command, coordinated foreign policy, and eventually common economic institutions. So something between a modern NATO and an early EU, but speak with one metaphorical voice to Berlin and Moscow. Does this sound familiar? Well, it should, because this is the exact same logic that created the European Union. The difference is that Piłsudski's vision was built specifically to counter both German and Russian imperialism simultaneously, not just to prevent France and Germany from going to war once again. However, that original goal for the EU is no longer really relevant, since that goal succeeded and Germany will not invade France anymore. Instead, the current geopolitical goal of the EU is shifting towards Piłsudski's vision, and that being countering the imperial ambitions of global superstates. The difference is that Poland back then was only worried about Germany and Russia, and now the EU is worried about China, the United States, and Russia. But moving back to the specifics about Piłsudski's vision for Intermarium, in its original form, it was actually quite modest. He was initially only proposing Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus to be part of this union. And it's not a coincidence that these are the borders that map almost perfectly into the old Commonwealth, which at its peak in the 17th century was the largest country in Europe by land area and governed multiple ethnicities under one federal structure. So he was not inventing something new necessarily, he was trying to resurrect something that had already worked for hundreds of years in the past. And it's worth noting that during that time of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, most of Europe was ruled by absolute monarchs. But meantime, roughly 20% of the Polish population had full voting rights and elected their own king. So that made the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth one of the earliest functioning democracies on Earth. In 1920, Poland signed a military alliance with the Ukrainian People's Republic. The joint Polish-Ukrainian army then launched an offensive against Bolshevik Russia, and they even captured Kyiv in May 1920. However, the alliance ultimately failed. The Bolsheviks counterattacked, the broader Intermarium vision collapsed when the Soviet army eventually stopped at the Battle of Warsaw, which in Poland we call the miracle of the Wisła River. The war ended in a compromise peace with the current borders you're seeing. The Treaty of Riga in 1921 officially formalized this, so this locked the borders and destroyed the Ukrainian allied state because it went to the Soviet Union. And this created a geopolitical reality where the Intermarium was structurally crippled before it had even properly started. Without Ukraine, there is no Intermarium. There never was and there never will be. The Federation project died with Ukraine, but Ukraine now is fully independent and is in the orbit of Polish influence. So the Intermarium is looking once again very plausible. But why didn't the Intermarium work in the interwar years? First of all, the neighbors it needed didn't want it. Lithuania refused to join because of the Vilnius debate. Poland had militarily seized the city in 1920, which Lithuania considered its historical capital, despite being mostly Polish. Because of this dispute, they literally had no diplomatic relations for almost 20 years. And without Lithuania, the Baltic connection was completely broken, and Czechoslovakia and Romania were suspicious of Polish dominance. And this is the fear of domination by a larger neighbor, the same primal fear I talk about in almost every video now. And this impulse killed the project before it even started. And like I said before, Piłsudski was not shy about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth comparisons. The second reason it failed was that Western powers weren't really interested. Britain and France were focusing on containing Germany and managing their own empires. A strong Eastern European federation would have complicated their diplomatic balancing act, and de facto the Paris Peace Conference actively discouraged it. Thirdly, and most importantly, the window was impossibly small. Just from 1918 to 1939, 21 years, That is all the time between Polish independence and the Nazi invasion. And this is not enough time to build institutions, harmonize economies, and overcome centuries of ethnic and territorial grievances. The EU has been building for 70 years and it's still lacking a lot of integration. But this time is on our side. And the fact is, if you want to create a federation through democratic integration and not an invasion, time is simply a crucial ingredient. However, Intermarium-like projects are getting revived by Poland in the last decades. The Visegrad Group, Hungary, Poland, Czechia and Slovakia, was founded in 1991, the moment the Soviet Union collapsed. 4 Central European countries immediately started coordinating on EU and NATO accession, using collective leverage to negotiate from a stronger position. And when that happened, I know Piłsudski's ghost was smiling. And then came the 3 Seas initiative, sounding suspiciously similar to the Intermarium project. Founded in 2015, 12 countries, all EU members between the Baltic, Black and Adriatic Seas, worked on integrating energy infrastructure, digital connectivity and transport corridors, so running north to south across exactly the geographic zone Piłsudski described. And like I said, the name is not a coincidence. The Polish architects of this project know their history, I know it. And the 3 Seas initiative has already attracted 50 billion in investment commitments, and under Donald Tusk, Poland has simultaneously deepened its connection to EU institutions while pushing harder for Eastern coordination. And the current Polish president of Karol Nawrocki is a huge history nerd. Before his presidency, I believe he was like the director of a history museum or something, and I'm sure he is seeing the potential of the modern Intermarium momentum. Warsaw is trying to be both a core EU player and the anchor for a separate eastern layer of integration. I've made a video on a multi-tiered Europe, but I've never mentioned the idea of a multi-bloc Europe. What if the multi-tiered Europe was not purely vertical, but if it had 2 federations sitting next to each other, both inside or closely associated within the broader EU framework? So for example, a Western core federation of France, Germany, Benelux, potentially Italy, that goes furthest into fiscal union, shared debt and political integration. And then next to it, an Eastern Federation, so essentially the modern Intermarium. And this federation would integrate deeply on defense, energy, transport, and security. But because of its cultural mistrust to each other, it would maintain more fiscal sovereignty and it would operate as a collective bloc within the broader EU. So 2 federations, 1 union, each built around the actual shared interests and threat perceptions of its members rather than forcing every country into identical institutions. I think this is actually a very interesting idea. Since currently the West is focused on countering US influence, while the East is focused on the Russian military threat. These are different problems linked, sadly, but they might legitimately require different institutional responses. And the cool thing is that if the final settlement ending the war in Ukraine involves restrictions on Ukraine joining NATO or the EU specifically, a revived Intermarium Międzymorze framework becomes Ukraine's most realistic path to security and integration. Not Brussels, not Washington, but Warsaw. So Poland as the anchor of this federation, with Ukraine, the Baltics, Czechia, Slovakia, and more, would finally have geopolitical weight to actually influence Brussels. But in short, the Intermarium failed because the fear of Polish dominance was stronger than the logic of collective survival. But the Intermarium vision at its core was correct. And the current geopolitical situation, Russia active on Europe's eastern border, the United States being structurally unreliable, and China trying to influence us through the Belt and Road Initiative, this is precisely the environment Piłsudski designed this idea for. The EU needs the East to be strong, not dependent on other superpowers, not resentful to the EU, but actually strong. And the East needs a framework that doesn't make every state feel like a second-class country waiting to eventually become Germany. That is the version of a European federation that I think is actually buildable and more plausible than just turning 27 separate governments into one overnight. So instead of one large integrated federation, we build a federation of federations. And Piłsudski saw that we need this 100 years ago. We are only now catching up through the 3 Cs initiative, the Visegrad format, and the European Union. One of the biggest questions when it comes to the Intermarium is what specific modern countries should be part of it. So let me know in the comments what you think the specific countries of this union should be. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe consider liking and subscribing. You can always unsubscribe later. Remember, you don't have to agree with me to engage with me and watch my videos. However, if you do agree with me, I recommend joining the First Domino movement in the description. And please let me know what video you want to see next. And as always, farewell, żegnam, and goodbye.